Oh, thank you everybody. Thank you everybody for sticking around. It's been a lovely day. And they say you only play Rixton with Glazebrook twice. Once on the way up and once on the way down. It's good to be back, everybody. This is a talk called The Haunted Generation. And it's very much, are we all kind of a certain age here? It's very much about growing up in the 1970s. Is there anybody? Yeah, there's not that many people that are too young for that, surely. Yeah, right. Right, first of all, I'm going to check that this works. I've been saying to Steve all day, I don't trust myself with the technology here, and I really don't. Oh no, it does, that's good. I'm going to do a little bit of, it actually starts quite dramatically, which I feel I've undermined now by waffling on for 2 minutes at the start of it about Rixton with Glazebrook and what have you. Okay, I'll get into character. There are 4 of them. Blank-faced children in old-fashioned pinafores standing at the end of the street, looking back at me. They could be Edwardian. It's very difficult to tell. Time is standing still. The world has suddenly become fuzzy, vague, sepia-tinted, and I am filled with an overwhelming and inexplicable feeling of strange, melancholy disquiet. They are, of course, the 4 children in the opening titles to, anybody? Bagpuss, absolutely, Bagpuss. It's 1977 and I am 4 years old and I'm watching Bagpuss in our front room, our shadowy brown front room with the flames from the coal fire casting shadows all around the room. At the time, I find it very hard to put my feelings into words. I'm only 4 years old, I don't have the vocabulary, but, well, 45 years old, 45 years, I can try. Bagpuss is a programme that makes me feel simultaneously reassured and unsettled. It's filled with old things, it's filled with lost things, with tatty puppets and sadness. It's got folk tales, it's got ships in bottles, it's got abandoned toys and long ago kings. It's like television made by the ghosts of those Edwardian children themselves, and it makes me feel, for want of a better word, haunted. I love Bagpuss. I still watch Bagpuss if I'm stressed. It's the universal cure-all. This wasn't a feeling that I just got from Bagpuss. It was a feeling that seemed to pervade an awful lot of my childhood in the 1970s. A feeling of kind of vague disquiet, of unsettlement. A feeling that I found in lots of things that were around at the time. I'll show you a few examples. The public information films that were on TV and in cinemas constantly throughout the 1970s. I am a spirit of dark and lonely water, here to trap the shove, the fool. And this is the kind of place you'd expect to find me. The spirit of dark and lonely water still gives me absolute shivers. Programmes for schools and colleges on BBC Two. Inexplicably, the countdown clock that seemed to tick away the seconds of my life, and of course what every kid did at school when the big wooden television was wheeled into the classroom was shoot off the seconds with their fingers as they went down. An obsession with the supernatural. We've got the Usborne Book of Ghosts here. It was an absolute fixture in my school library. Nothing within the Usborne Book of Ghosts suggests that ghosts aren't real. This just seems to be a textbook that tells you they absolutely are, and they might come into your bedroom every single night. And then perhaps the most terrifying of all. Movement, music and mime in primary school halls. So all of this stuff combined to create this feeling of very vague, very nebulous disquiet and unsettlement. And for years I tried to describe these feelings, these memories that I had, and I would say to friends throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, do you remember those weird feelings that we had as kids? All the scary stuff on TV, and they would say, yeah, wow, Doctor Who and Sapphire and Steel and stuff like that. And I would say, well, yeah, kind of that, but maybe not quite as scary. Not out and out terrifying, just kind of melancholy and strange and slightly weird. It was a very, very difficult thing to put into words, and I tried for decades to describe it, and some people got it, but most people didn't. To a point where I really started to think it was just me that had these feelings. But then one day in 1998, I heard a piece of music. And it was on a CD that was given away on the front of the NME, which dates me. Am I the only one here that bought the new Musical Express every week? Hooray! So I heard this piece of music, and it was a life-changing moment for me, and it was a piece of music by a band, well, a duo, called Boards of Canada. And it came from an album called Music Has the Right to Children. And when I heard this piece of music, I had to sit down and kind of gather my senses a little bit. It really, really affected me, because this was the first time that I thought, somebody else has had those feelings. Somebody else has encapsulated those strange feelings of growing up in the 1970s and feeling a little bit out of time, a little bit out of place. I'm just going to play you a tiny snippet from it. I'm really hoping this works. Are we going for this, Dave? Is this going to be really, really loud like it was when we tried it? To encapsulate all of those feelings. And I played it over and over again. It's a track called Roy G. Biv, which is an acronym for the colours of the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And that was the first time that I thought somebody else has had these feelings, because they've put them so perfectly into their music. Now at the time, back in 1998, I just thought this was a complete one-off. Thought maybe I've imagined it, maybe it's just a band that somehow chanced upon the same kind of feelings that I've had. But then I started to become aware that there was more of an artistic movement happening here, and more music and art and books and TV programs were starting to be influenced by these feelings of slight disquiet of growing up in the 1970s. The next thing that I saw that really, this couldn't have been a coincidence, they absolutely nailed it, was a television program, and it kind of went out unheralded on BBC Two in 2001, and it was a program made by Peter Serafinowicz and Robert Popper called Look Around You, and just an incredible spoof of BBC schools and colleges programs of the 1970s. That's the second series of Look Around You, is kind of like Tomorrow's World spoof. You see Oscar-winning Olivia Colman there on the left-hand side. That's the second series. I'm going to play a little clip here. So this is the first series of Look Around You. This is their spoof of BBC schools and colleges programs, and the tone of it was just so immaculate. I thought, and that's it, again, they've nailed it.
Experiment 1. An experiment was carried out to produce a visualization of the spirit. In order to visualize, we'll be using this piece of equipment, a Gloriette 80 materializer. The Gloriette is a complex arrangement of diodes, marbles, and valves, which enables us to make visual contact with the disc. The machine is turned on, and then primed by inserting the crucifix. The candle is placed on a nap of Cornwall, And the scientist begins his incantation. Make sure you note it down. There's our spirit. He appears to be in some distress. Perhaps he's missing colleagues or loved ones back at home. He may even be missing you. Do you know this man?
So there's a little clip of Look Around You, and you can see how I watched that and thought, my God, that is my childhood personified. Playing the scientist there is the film director Edgar Wright, who made Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz. So I began to be very much tuned into this stuff, and it really began to become an obsession for me to discover, in particular, the music that was being influenced by these feelings. And I started to discover lots of different artists. So Broadcast, a brilliant band founded in the 1990s in Birmingham, who again making music influenced by 1970s library music and public information films. The Focus Group, which Julian House, he makes kind of sound collage, again very much influenced by all of that stuff. I discovered Ghost Box Records, an absolutely extraordinary record label founded in 2005 by Julian from the Focus Group and by Jim Jupp, who records as Bellbury Polly. Found wonderful albums like this, The Bellbury Tales, Mind How You Go, which is the Advisory Circle, the nom de plume of Kate Brooks. Again, just really encapsulating these feelings. These are all albums from the 2000s, from the mid-2000s, but you can see even the cover designs are just perfect encapsulations of that era. I'll play you a little bit of the Advisory Circle here, and you can hear what I'm talking about. I have. That is the Advisory Circle, yeah, the extraordinary Kate Brooks. So by the middle of the 2000s, it's becoming obvious that there's something going on here, that there's a movement arising that's been influenced by all of these feelings. Those feelings of growing up, I think in a period roughly between the mid-1960s and the mid-1980s, although we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So did it have a name, this movement? Well, from 2006 it did, because two music writers who'd been very much interested in this movement since the start, Simon Reynolds and Mark Fischer, began to refer to it as hauntology. It's a really interesting word, hauntology. They didn't coin the phrase at all. They didn't create the word hauntology. It's a word invented by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who used it in a completely different context. Derrida used it to kind of describe the spectre of Marxism still looming over post-war Europe. He used it in that context. Using it to describe this movement of music and art, I've spoken to Simon Reynolds about it. Mark Fischer sadly no longer with us. I've spoken to Simon about it. Simon says, no, basically, we just created the word out of nothing. It has no connection to Jacques Derrida or Marxism at all. He said, basically, haunt, well, that sounds a bit like ghosts and stuff, so that's cool. And ontology, well, that sounds like, you know, that's sort of science, isn't it? So that's cool as well. That feels like open university modules. Others have tried to draw a more profound connection between Marxism and the hauntology art movement. But to be honest, if the bloke who used the phrase first says, no, it's got nothing to do with it, I'm kind of inclined to believe him, really. So it's just exploded over the last 50 years, really, I think. We've now got countless record labels, hundreds, if not thousands of artists. including, is Gavin around anyway? Oh, there, yes, I'm looking around for you. Yes, spurious transients. Am I allowed to include you in this movement here?
Yeah, I think so.
Is that all right? Yeah. I thoroughly recommend Gavin's album. It's fantastic. I wrote about it in the 14 Times last year. So yeah, hundreds, if not thousands of artists working in this genre as well. And not just musicians, but writers as well. So I started to really enjoy the work of people like Richard Littler. Richard Littler is a writer and artist who's created a project called Scarfolk. Yeah, lots of you have seen Scarfolk. Richard is from the northwest. He grew up in the outskirts of Manchester, I think, again in the 1970s. And basically, Richard was just terrified of absolutely everything when he was a child. He used to have, which way round is it? Is hypnagogic the one when you're falling asleep, hallucinations? He used to have hypnagogic hallucinations all the time, and he would see like giant spiders and things like that on his bedroom ceiling. So he, as you can imagine, that gave him a somewhat nervous disposition. He basically just says he was a big baby when he was a kid. But Richard Littler has created this world called Scarfolk. It's a brilliant website. It's been going for, it must be over 10 years now. And the premise of it is that the town of Scarfolk is kind of stuck in a dystopian 1977 forever. And he just does brilliant spoofs, like public information, like posters, I see penguin guides, practical witchcraft today, how to hurt people. I think there's another one about removing a child's brain that's on the scalp. But Richard more and more uses Scarfolk as political satire as well, because he's kind of now of the opinion that what started out as a joke has sort of like diverged with reality. Richard now kind of thinks we're living in Scarfolk anyway, and that nothing he does can parody it anymore. So yeah, Scarfolk is out there. Books like Scarred for Life, written by two writers from Liverpool, Stephen Botherstone and Dave Lawrence, who've been really lucky to work with in the last couple of years, done lots of live shows with them. Again, this is just like an extraordinary compendium of 1970s TV. You can't really tell from just the front cover, but it's the size of a bloody doorstep. If you order it, you'll need to get somebody to carry it into the house for you. It's enormous. But it's just a brilliant dissection of all of this sort of 1970s, it's a 1980s volume now, stuff that they, mainly TV, but it does go a little bit beyond TV as well. And it's still finding new recruits, this movement, because I was so fascinated by all of this and so engrossed with it that in 2016, having done a couple of little pieces for the 14 Times over the years, I contacted David Sutton, the editor of the 14 Times. Second mention for David Sutton on this stage today. He'll be getting big-headed if he knows about this. I'd asked him if I could write a feature for the 14 Times about the whole hauntology movement, which I did. And I spoke to Richard Littler, to Jim Joke from Ghostbox Records, Francis Castle from another label, Clay Pipe. Spoke to Simon Reynolds for this as well, to Johnny Trunk, who runs a label called Trunk Records, who are just brilliant label that reissues lots of vintage strangeness from this era. And I wrote a huge feature, The Haunted Generation. It was the first time. I'm normally terrible at titles, but that one seems to have stuck. I'm really pleased with that one. It came to me on a walk in the woods one day. I know, The Haunted Generation, that would work as a title. And it went in the 14 Times, and I didn't think that much more about it really, but the reaction I got was just, for about a year afterwards, there were still letters coming into the letters page about it, again from people saying, I didn't know that other people had these feelings about their childhood in the 1970s, I thought it was just me. So as Richard Littler from Scarfolk actually said to me for this article, it's like a support group. It's like in Close Encounters when people just walk towards the mountain. So, having become engrossed with this movement, this artistic movement, that's very much rooted, the movement itself only began in the late 1990s and has only taken off this century, since the turn of the millennium, I was kind of intrigued to really look into what it was about the original era, about that period from, I think, roughly mid-60s to mid-80s, what it was that had such a profound effect on the kids that grew up during that era and that had stayed with them and that had encouraged them and kind of almost made them feel compounded to make art influenced by those feelings. So I've been looking back at that a little bit, and this talk is very much about the kind of stuff that I think happened during that period. And I think it's a collision of different cultural and sociological and technological influences that all come together during that era. So I think one major factor in the media that we were exposed to as children in the 1970s is the influence of the past on that particular decade. I think it weighs really heavily on the children's TV and books and films of that period. So Bagpuss itself, like I said, Bagpuss is very much rooted in Edwardiana. I was fully aware when I watched Bagpuss at the age of 5 that it wasn't of the 1970s. I couldn't articulate the era that it evoked because I didn't know about Edwardian photography at that age, but I knew that it wasn't of the now. I've since become really friendly with Sandra Kerr, who is the musician who, with then husband John Faulkner, wrote and sang all of the music in Bagpuss. Sandra is also the voice of Madeline the Rag Doll, much to her pride. And I've spoken to her about those influences of the past in Bagpuss, and she says she thinks it was very much Oliver Postgate and Peter Firmin who created Bagpuss between them. She thinks it's essentially them evoking the period that their parents grew up in. So Oliver and Peter were born in 1925 and 1928 respectively. She thinks Bagpuss is very much them looking to the period just before their own childhoods. But that idea of the past bleeding into the present is there in so many other forms of kids' entertainment. So books like The Owl Service, the wonderful Alan Garner, who's my literary hero, and again, you know, about a trio of young people finding themselves reenacting this myth cycle of ancient Welsh folklore that keeps reoccurring in the same valley. The Dark is Rising sequence of books by Susan Cooper, again about these ancient forces that are kind of inherent within the English countryside. And Asticoat by Penelope Lively, which is about a very 1970s kids finding themselves haunted by echoes of a plague village. All of these books are about like the shadow of the past somehow bleeding through into very ordinary lives in the 1970s. And I think when we look at this idea of the past influencing the present, I think we also need to look a lot at the British folk revival. So from the late 1940s, 1950s onwards, there's this huge resurgence of interest in traditional British folk music. Spearheaded by a chap called Bert Lloyd, who actively went out and collected traditional oral folk songs and stories that hadn't yet been written down. So by the mid-1960s, pretty much every town in the UK has a traditional folk club where the performers are singing these old songs and, crucially, telling stories as well that accompany these songs, telling stories from centuries past. And lots of these songs and stories have a supernatural tint as well. And I think that resurgence of interest in the British folk tradition combines with like the explosion of TV in the 1960s and 70s. So certainly by the late 1960s, the television industry is expanding enormously. You've got BBC Two launched in 1964, you've got colour TV in 1967, and the TV industry was looking for new recruits. And where did they go to find those new recruits? Well, quite often they went to the folk clubs. There was certainly a producer at the BBC called Peter Charlton, who was a very, very active member of lots of traditional folk clubs in the London area. I think there was even a BBC folk club at that point, and he would actively recruit from the folk clubs folk performers and singers to make the jump into children's television. So certainly you look at Sandra Kerr and John Faulkner, who went straight on to Bagpuss. You've got people like Mike Harding, you've got Bob Roberts, Julie Felix, Alex Glasgow, the legendary Wally White with Ollie Beak in full view there, made the jump into children's television. Even Jackanory itself, you know, the name Jackanory is from it's a folk rhyme collected in, I'm trying to find the date, I know it's 1760. But I think for the best example of that link between traditional folk music, scary traditional folk music and folk traditions, and children's television of the 1970s, I think we need to look no further than Tony Arthur. There was a little cheer went up from somewhere there, that was nice. The extraordinary Tony Arthur, who, just as Tony was starting to work as a television presenter for the under fives, lest we forget here, Tony became a presenter on Play Away and Play School from 1971 onwards. But at the same time, she was making albums with her husband Dave, like Hearken to the Witch's Rune, which is the most phenomenal album of supernatural folk songs. And the story behind it is just incredible. Basically, Dave and Tony were already really interested in supernatural folk song and story, but they wanted to find out if there was a link between that and the 20th century Wicca religion. So they contacted Alex Sanders, who was like something of a scourge of the tabloids at the time. The tabloids referred to him as the king of the witches, and would run these incredibly lurid stories about the Wiccan coven that he ran in London with his wife Maxine. So Dave and Tony contacted Alex and said, basically, can we come along and ask you a few questions about Wicca and its links to traditional folk songs and stories? And Alex, who was kind of game for any publicity really, said, absolutely, damn right you can. And they ended up joining the coven, thus making Tony Arthur surely the only Play-Away presenter to have danced naked at a Wiccan ceremony with the self-proclaimed king of the witches, unless there's something about Brian Cant that we really don't know about. I had a fantastic experience last year. Dave and Tony are no longer together as a couple, but they're still really good friends. And I really wanted to tell the story of this album. So I contacted them both. I did huge interviews with the pair of them for the 40 Times again. And it made the cover, I was dead proud. And they were great. And I asked them about that link between the folk clubs and folk traditions and children's television of the 1970s. And they absolutely acknowledged it was a thing. I'll quote Dave. Dave Arthur said, "Folk music is perfect for kids' TV. It's gentle, the tunes are interesting, you can write nice lyrics. It's an easy way into kids' songwriting." My God, some of the terrifying stuff on this album. I wouldn't describe it as having nice lyrics. And Tony, I mean, I was just fascinated to know from Tony whether she found it slightly incongruous that she was making albums like Hearken to the Witch's Rune at the same time as she was presenting programs for the under fives. And she said it never crossed her mind for a second. Great quote from Tony, again, I put this in the feature. She said, "It didn't even occur to me that the two would get linked. We were hippies. Nobody minded about anything. I remember presenting, seeing and doing, dressed as a witch and running all over Hampstead Heath. Oh, it was a rich old time." Brilliant, Tony Arthur. This article appeared about a year ago, and every now and again I'll get a mysterious package in the post, and it'll be a couple of jars of homemade marmalade from Tony Arthur. If you told me that at the age of 4, the died and gone to heaven. So, as well as this idea of the past bleeding into the present, I think the 1970s also had a very distinct idea of the future as well. So bear in mind, this is the era of the space race, of brutalist architecture, of new towns. It's very much an era that's looking ahead to a future that I think you can argue we didn't necessarily get, and that's one of Mark Fisher's big theories, is this idea of lost futures. I think one of Mark Fisher's overriding definitions of hauntology was that it was the present being haunted, not necessarily by the past that we did have, but by the future that we never got. These kind of utopian ideals where we'd all be riding on monorails to work, and we'd be working for 2 hours a day because robots would do it all, and we'd all be happy to fly around on jetpacks all day. None of it happened. And I think one of Mark Fisher's arguments was that we kind of never quite got over that, the fact that it didn't. So essentially, we were promised this, and what we actually got was this. It just never happened. But, there are absolutely artists of this genre that find the brutalist architecture of the 1960s and 70s incredibly evocative, and I can absolutely see that as well. And again, it's all tied in with this vision of the future of the space race. I come from the northeast of England, and there's a place called Billingham on Teesside that was the town centre was completely redeveloped in a brutalist style in the 1960s, with the explicit intention of it tying in with the Apollo missions, that it would have this space-age feel. Much as I love Billingham, I think if you went to the town centre now, you would be hard-pressed to draw any kind of firm line between that and the urge to explore the farthest reaches of the galaxy. But yeah, it's all absolutely in there. And I think as well as that vision of the future as being utopian, there's also possibly the dark side of that, this idea that the vision could be the future could be dystopian as well, and that there would be, a post-apocalyptic society that we would inherit in the 1980s. I don't think anybody who grew up in the era of the Cold War would kind of easily forget those feelings of thinking, well, the balloon could go up at any point. It's funny, I did a Scarred for Life show a couple of weeks ago, and Dave, one of the writers that I do the show with, he concluded it by saying, I grew up in the era of AIDS and the Cold War, and I spent my entire childhood feeling that I'd been killed by a deadly disease or blown up by the Russians. So I never thought those feelings had come back. Well, here we are. So yeah, this idea that the future might not be brilliant was a big thing for kids of that era as well. That we might be blown up in a nuclear holocaust, or that there's a program called Noah's Castle from the 1980s, a children's show in which hyperinflation has reduced Britain to just like an absolutely terrifying. I'm scaring myself when I say this now because it seems all too real. Or indeed, the possibility of us all being killed by dangerous, deadly plants walking across the street, Day of the Triffids. And I think another crucial aspect of all of this is that we kind of had time to think about it in the 1970s. We got 3 channels on TV. We got one TV in the house that we all had to watch together. So the idea that, I think now, I hate using the phrase these days, but I'm going to have to. These days, it's very, very easy to tailor your own personal media experience. If you'd said to me at the age of 9, what do you want to watch on TV? I would have said Doctor Who, please, and I would have watched it over and over and over again, because I love Doctor Who and I found it comforting. But I don't think it would have been the greatest thing for me to do that. Of course, these days it's absolutely possible to do that. But back then, because we only had one television, because we only had 3 channels, you were frequently exposed to things that you would never in a million years have chosen to watch. And I think that's a huge part of this as well. The other thing that I often wonder about, and I've never kind of, I need to write a little bit more about this as well. I often wonder if time off school played a big part in it, which I know, like, in the last couple of years, lots of kids have had time off school. But when, I sometimes go on podcasts and I'm asked to describe, what is that feeling? What is that 1970s feeling? And I always say, oh, it's the feeling of watching the Open University on a Tuesday afternoon when it's raining and you've got chicken pox. And I often wonder if that element of childhood illness, do kids still get chicken pox and mumps and things like that? It's nowhere near as common, I don't think, is it? Yeah. So I do sometimes wonder. I'll have to think about that a bit more. Now, all of this would not be anywhere near as traumatizing if there was an element of distance in the 1970s between the kind of everyday and the otherworldly. But there generally wasn't, and I think this is a big part of it as well. So the supernatural in the 1970s was treated with respect and with seriousness by the mainstream media. This isn't the first time we've seen this picture today, but we've got the Enfield poltergeist here. You'd see things like the Loch Ness Monster. You would see subjects like the Abominable Snowman being treated with kind of with seriousness by mainstream news programmes. So you would see, you'd watch Nationwide on BBC One at 6 o'clock, and there would be a feature about Dennis Healy's economic policies and industrial action somewhere in the country, and in between there would be a feature about a ghost sighting, or a poltergeist, or a UFO sighting. And it wouldn't be treated especially tongue-in-cheek. So for me as a kid growing up during that period, I have no cynicism about this whatsoever. Does anybody remember the Hexham Heads? Yeah. Yes! That's become like a little bit of a holy grail for me, because whenever we do the Scarred for Life shows, we always say to people at the end of the shows, do you have things that you remember that you think nobody else does? And the Hexham Heads comes up with remarkable frequency. This is a feature on Nationwide, essentially about the discovery of 2 tiny stone heads in a garden in Hexham in Northumberland, that then sparked off like this extraordinary sequence of supernatural visitations. I think there's a werewolf that comes up the stairs in this suburban house in Hexham, and when it's discovered, it runs out through the garden and jumps over the fence. But this was on Nationwide. It was presented as a factual news item on Nationwide. I tried to find it. I worked for the BBC for years, and they foolishly granted me access to their archive, but I still couldn't find it. From what I can gather, I think the audio exists somewhere, but not the actual programme anymore. I assume because somebody taped it off the telly on a little cassette recorder, but I've never heard it. I've seen a transcript, but I'd love to hear the actual original thing. And in addition to all of this, I think it was an era when the avant-garde was seen as kind of a healthy thing for children to be exposed to. So, when we watched Doctor Who in the 1970s, it didn't have the big, flashy, zippy orchestral music that it has now. It had the BBC Radiophonic Workshop making experimental music that was often completely atonal, it was scary, it was at the very cutting edge of electronic musical technology in the 1960s. So this is the state broadcaster using public money. And I think, genuinely feeling it had a remit to do this, that it shouldn't take the easy option, that it should present the avant-garde and the experimental to children at 5 o'clock on a Saturday tea time. And I think it's exemplarised the approach of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop by this album. Is anybody aware of The Seasons? It's, honestly, seek it out. It's the most phenomenal piece of work. So this is an album from 1969. It's music by David Kane from the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. The poetry of Ronald Duncan, read by Derek Boskill, who read lots of BBC schools programmes from that era. Now, bear in mind, this was genuinely produced with the sole intent of it being played in primary schools for children under the age of 10, some under the age of 5, to interpret via the medium of dance and movement. I'm going to play you a little section from the Seasons here.
When winter whips, the gaunt elms shudder within the groin of grief, their branches breaking. When winter whips, old men discover that their life is a dream they can't remember.
It's for the under 5s! If you took that within 20 yards of a primary school now, it'd be rounded up and shot. It's a brilliant album. It got reissued by Trunk Records about 10 years ago. I think it's still available on CD, and it's absolutely extraordinary. So all of this stuff combined, I think, plays a part. Another thing I think worth chucking into the mix is Frances Castle, who runs the record label Clay Pipe, said to me something that's really stuck with me. She said, the fuzziness and the vagueness of analog technology played a part. That everything was seen or heard through a slight hiss. The TV would go in and out of focus, and that added to it. We're so used now to everything being crystal clear, but in those days, it just wasn't. And I think she's absolutely spot on. I think the fuzziness and the vagueness of analog technology plays a big part in all of this as well. And kind of linked to that, I think the transience of it all too. So some of the most profound and unsettling TV that I saw as a kid, I saw once, and I had no expectation that I would ever see any of it again. I had no way of recording it. Stuff wasn't often repeated that much because there are only 3 channels and lots of new programs being made all the time. So modern kids are able to access their memories over and over again and rewatch them and familiarise themselves with them, but we weren't. You know, we saw some of the most disturbing and memorable TV of the 1970s of my childhood. I don't really know what it was. And this is the thing that, you know, I've had people coming up to me today saying, can you identify this programme that I saw 45 years ago and I don't know what it was? So I think that plays a part. This stuff is stuck in our heads, but it's nebulous, it's vague, it's hard to retrieve. And I think that was part of everyday life at the time as well. I don't know if this is something that's unique to me, but I suspect not. The number of photographs of me for the first 18 years of my life was probably less than 100, I think. And I've met lots of people with fewer photographs than that from their childhoods. You know, you probably get 100 photographs taken of you on the first day of your life now, but we just have no way of recording life. So because of that, this stuff kind of stewed in our heads. We had time to think about it, but there was a longing involved as well. There were gaps in our memories that then whirled around themselves, and the gaps, because of the way that the memory works, the gaps became more and more vague, and the gaps began to be filled with memories that maybe weren't as precise as we thought they were. And I think that's a huge part of this artistic movement. Richard Littler from Scarfolk said to me that the key to what he does is filling in those gaps in his memory, with completely absurd fiction that feels like it might have come from that era, but in fact it doesn't, and Richard does it so brilliantly. There's the Scarfolk annual that he put out. This is it's an annual from 2018, but it's absolutely marvellously done, again filling those gaps in. So all of these things combine, and I think there's a sweet spot of media technology as well. So, as I said, we've got an explosion of television. We've got a TV set, pretty much in every house by the 1970s. It's on if there's somebody in the house. It's increasingly in colour. We're at the peak of TV ratings. You know, the biggest shows in the country were getting 20 to 25 million viewers, which is just, you know, if you said that to a modern TV producer, they're just absolutely unthinkable. But all of that had enough restrictions, you know, the fact that it's scheduled TV only, that we can't record it, that it's kind of not geared towards what we want, it's geared to what TV producers want, the fact that it's only 3 channels, all of that combines to give us en masse access to things that we might not want to see, but that made a huge impression on us. So, as I say, I wrote about this stuff for... Oh, where's my clicker gone? There it is. Well, there we go. I wrote about this stuff for the Fortean Times in 2017. Not expecting an awful lot of reaction, but the letters just kept coming in. There's a load of them there from the issue after, and from the issue after that. Hartley Hare from Pipkins there. Always nice to give Hartley a bit of an airing. I was genuinely overwhelmed, really thrilled by it, and again by the number of people that just said, I thought it was only me that had these feelings, but it turned out it wasn't. And the actual artistic movement itself has just continued to explode, so I've got a few examples here. Does anybody remember Picture Box? Yeah. Yes! Oh, with that theme tune that terrified me. So this looks like it's going to be the opening theme to Picture Box, but there is an actor, writer and director called Sean Reynard who has created a character called Quentin Smyers. And this is the first time that Quentin appeared on YouTube. So I'm just going to play this. Oh, that's not it. Hang on, where are we? Have we got him? Oh, maybe I have. Have I not got Quentin in there? Oh, I gave it a massive build-up as well, Steve. What should we talk about while he does this?
Picture Box, there we are.
Stick that one in as well. There we go. Yeah, got the green one. Yeah, that, yeah.
Hold up. Oh, just doing stuff.
Are we going to get a Windows update? We'll have to wait around for an hour.
No. You ready? Go on.
Yeah, so I found this as well recently. I don't know who's behind this. I've tried to contact them and they're giving absolutely nothing away, but this series appeared on YouTube last year. It purports to be a BBC school series from 1974 that was never used. It's called British Cryptids, and I just thought it was brilliant.
Were it not for the physical evidence left behind, the Twiggy Witch would belong very firmly in the supernatural realm of fairies, elves, and goblins. But written accounts, dating from as far back as the 1700s, invariably describe a very real, though rarely seen, living creature. Sighted predominantly along the Welsh borders and reported frequently century, the Twiggy Witch's appearance immediately explains the name by which it is commonly known. Witnesses describe a small bipedal animal made of what looked like grey, fragile-looking twigs. But although such a camouflage is hardly unique in nature, the Twiggy Witch has other, stranger characteristics.
So there we go, it's the Hereford Twiggy Witch. There's a whole series of them on YouTube. Look for the British Cryptids channel on YouTube. They're great. The Yorkshire Yeti is a big favourite of mine as well. I think loads of this stuff has started to appear in film over the last 10 years. So Ben Wheatley, great film director, made films like A Field in England, very hallucinogenic vision of the English Civil War. We've got Peter Strickland making films that are absolutely filled with that aesthetic. This is his last film, In Fabric. Julian House from the Focus Group, who's a brilliant graphic designer and artist, does all of his title sequences, and they're just incredible. Matthew Holness, actor, comedian, writer, made Possum. It's one of the darkest but most brilliant films I've seen in recent years, with the soundtrack by the BBC Radiophonic Workshop gathered together again. So huge amounts of this stuff out there. Now for a long time, I kind of... Oh no, I was going to stick another... What have I missed here? I've missed something. Oh, talk amongst yourselves for a second. This is... This is the bit that I didn't write in 2019 when I was meant to do this talk originally. So I'm into new territory here. Oh yeah, no, new music. I recommend, there's so much of the music influenced by this stuff out there now, but I really want to play a little bit. I talked about artists being influenced by brutalist architecture. This is an artist, well, he's called Gordon Chapman Fox, but he records as the Warrington Runcorn Newtown Development Plan. This is a bit of his album.
Provide a balanced town in which the motor car has certain privileges, public transport has certain privileges, and people, perhaps most of all, have the privilege of walking about in safety from their homes to as far as the children themselves to schools and the parents.
So again, it's from an album that came out in 2021, but I just think it perfectly encapsulates like the spirit of the era. Got art, like Frances Castlehill mentioned, who runs the Clay Pipe label. Her graphic novel Stagdale is about the shadows of the Second World War, seeping into the 1970s. Will McLean's book, The Apparition Phase, about a pair of twins in the 1970s that fake a ghost photo and find that the ghost might be a little bit more real than they anticipated. Current TV, The Witchfinder, Tim Keen, Daisy May Cooper, currently on BBC One. I think again very much influenced by the spirit of the era, and I think if you want to look at examples of kind of ancient folk traditions and stories and the strangeness of the English countryside on current TV, then Mackenzie Cook's reimagining of Wurzel Gummidge I think is a truly beautiful thing. So this stuff is almost passing over into the mainstream now, I think. And I think it's really interesting that when I first wrote the Haunted Generation feature back in 2017, I kind of saw this phenomenon as being very rooted to a time and place, to Britain of the 1970s, because everything that all of the art that I was experiencing and finding seemed to be influenced by the 1970s British childhood, for all of the reasons that I've talked about. But I've since kind of reassessed this, and I think I'm completely wrong, because the more I've written about it and the more that I've spoken to people, the more I've realised I think it's a much more international phenomenon than I first thought, and I think the time scale is broader as well. So I'm just going to whistle through a couple of recent albums here. Justin Hopper is an artist that now works a lot with Ghost Box Records. Justin is American, and although he would admit he's a complete Anglophile, but his haunted experiences of the 1970s are more to do with the Twilight Zone and Sesame Street, and the albums of Ken Nordine. It's very much an American take on hauntology. This is Toy Toy Toy. It's an artist called Sebastian Counts. Sebastian is German. Again, it's on Ghostbox Records, and Sebastian is really interested in exploring the folklore of the German countryside, which has got its own kind of dark aspect to it, because German folklore was absolutely appropriated by the Nazis and kind of held up as an example of German purity, and Sebastian wants to reclaim that and say, no, this stuff predates the Nazis by centuries. This is a band called Beautified Junkyards, who are Portuguese. They make music, again, that's, you know, I've spoken to Joao, who's the main guy, he's the guy on the left. I think they're based in Lisbon, but they do they decamp to the Portuguese countryside a lot to make their music. He says he totally understands like the British haunted childhood of the 1970s. I said, that's really interesting. So I said to him, you know, it's fascinating that somebody that grew up in Portugal, in the beautiful sunny country of Portugal, could identify with that kind of dark, unsettled British childhood of the 1970s. So was Portugal particularly dark in the 1970s? And he said, well, we did have a military revolution in 1974. And one that was sparked off by a song in the Eurovision Song Contest, I believe. That was the signal to take to the streets. So, Beautified Junkyards, again, brilliant band, well worth checking out. And I've been contacted by younger people as well, who are keen to point out that basically their haunted childhoods happened in the 1990s and beyond. And although the triggers to those feelings are very different, they're convinced that the feelings themselves are absolutely the same. So Jim Jupp from Ghostbox Records told me about somebody that he'd met who was about 30 now, but they had said their childhood had been completely haunted by this. The Judder Man, absolutely. It's an advert for an alcopop called Mets that was first broadcast in 2000. Was this a big one for you? Were you scared of the Judder Man? Yeah? And is it the same feeling as well, that sort of... Yeah. So I think this is brilliant. It's not a feeling that's rooted to that time at all. And I was contacted by a woman who, again, she'd be about 30 now. And talking about, you know, we talked about the fuzziness of TV and how the strangeness of analog technology brought about these feelings in people. She said that her trigger for kind of analog, well, not even analog, but old technology, was this. Brace yourselves, and this absolutely gives her the shivers. It's the Windows 2000 startup music, because it's just gone. You know, nobody's going to hear that anymore because nobody's got Windows 2000 installed. I assume nobody's got Windows 2000 installed anymore. If you have, update it. So, what I thought was a very British, very 1970s phenomenon, I think now extends way beyond all of that, and I think that's a really nice thing. I think it's a reassuring thing. And I'm going to finish by quoting Jim Jupp from Ghostbox Records, who said to me in that Haunted Generation feature, he said, maybe the future of this movement is the fact that childhood itself is a bit weird and there's stuff lodged in people's memories that troubles them, that they can't quite explain, even in an era when they could look everything up. Hopefully, not all of the answers are there, and there's still some mystery and a sense of wonder. So what I take from that is the fact that no matter where and when we were born, we are all, for less and greater, for better and worse, the haunted generation.